This seminar is entitled Raising Bilingual Children, 6 Steps for Success. And this program was built out of about 8 years working with over 1,000 families who are raising bilingual children. I've taken all of the knowledge and input that I've had from these families over the years and developed what I think is a cohesive model for preparing for successful bilingualism in your family. The first step for preparing for a bilingual journey with your children is to learn the theory. Now, many people believe that bilingualism is something that happens easily, and bilingualism is something that happens naturally. And to a certain extent, this is true. There are places in the world where bilingualism is the norm. And in fact, if you look statistically, 60 to 75% of the world is bilingual, as opposed to a much smaller percentage, which is monolingual and mainly in English-speaking countries. So, if so many people in the world manage to become bilingual, presumably not all of them have access to books and experts and resources. How do they manage it within their communities? And the answer actually is a simple one. If you are raising your child in a bilingual community where both of your languages are mirrored in appropriate use, bilingualism can happen easily. So for example, all across Africa, there's a multilingual paradigm in which the children will speak one language within their families, one language without their families, and then there's usually a post-colonial language influence as well, French or English generally. And so with everybody in their environment using the same languages and in the same context, the children pick up those languages and can use them appropriately as well, with little to no planning on the parts of families or educators. However, if you are, for example, an English and Italian family living in the Netherlands, you need to plan for successful bilingualism for your children, because there is no community around you and around your child who's using the same languages for the same reasons. Their input in each of those languages is much more restricted to what they can get from the parents, and their opportunities for output are also restricted to the community that's available for them. And so it's important to understand the theory behind what causes successful bilingualism and what causes unsuccessful bilingualism, so that you can think about your family circumstances and plan accordingly for your children. So it's important for yourself as a bilingual parent to understand what are the successful elements for bilingualism, and it's important for your children to understand those as well. So as a family, learn the theory together and understand what you need to do to come to the end of your journey successfully. Importantly also, you need to learn the theory for others around you. Very many people have opinions about bilingualism and its suitability or desirability, and not all of these opinions are positive. In fact, I've worked with many families who've had their pediatricians tell them to only speak one language with their children because they'll damage them. I've worked with families who've had their children's teachers say that they should only use one language because otherwise they'll never speak properly. I've had families who work with all kinds of professionals expressing all kinds of opinions about bilingualism which are inaccurate. And so if you're choosing to raise your children bilingually, you will need to advocate for them along the way. You will need to be the person who informs pediatricians, other doctors, caregivers, professionals, what exactly you're doing with your children and why, and that you are comfortable and confident in their success. So that when somebody says to you, "Oh, you shouldn't be speaking that language with your children, it's a terrible thing to do," that you feel confident saying, actually, research shows that children can learn more than one language successfully, and we're quite happy that our children are doing so. What happens often is that parents go merrily along their bilingual way, and when they come to a stumbling block, they start to panic because they don't actually know what they're doing, and at that moment of panic very often make bad decisions, like to drop a language or to use the languages differently than they already are. And so a solid understanding of the theory behind child bilingualism will help you in your journey with your child. You can learn the theory in many ways. You can read books, you can access online resources, you can go to seminars, you can talk with other bilingual families. Whichever method you choose, make sure you have a good understanding about how you will plan for successful bilingualism for your children. But the second step for success with bilingualism is to set your goals. The first point to consider is which languages are you choosing for your children and why are you choosing those languages. Now, many people say, why? Well, why not? But it's important, especially if you have more than 2 languages in your life, to choose which ones are your priorities. You have to look realistically at what you can offer your children, long-term and short-term, in terms of their languages, and make the choices that make the most sense. Personally and professionally, I believe that the languages that are the most important are the languages of the parents, no matter what languages those are. So even if a parent speaks a lesser spoken language, it's still very critical to raise the child speaking that language. Otherwise, you're creating a divide between the child and part of his or her heritage and culture. And so even if, for example, you believe that if you speak English and a dialect of Italian, that English is more important, consider the effects on your children of being divorced from the Italian side of their family and the dialect speakers. And so once you've decided which languages are important in your life, look at your reasons behind them and make sure that those reasons are equal in terms of importance. Generally speaking, I recommend that you pick 3 languages at most. It's hard to achieve successful bilingualism with more than 3, which brings me to my next point, which is to set your goals for the languages involved. So once you've laid out which languages your children want to speak, you have to decide to what extent do you want them to be able to use these languages. There are 2 kinds of goals we can set for our children linguistically. The first is a communicative goal. A communicative goal basically means that you want your children to be able to speak and understand the language to an efficient and effective level. It means that if they travel home to visit family who speak that language, they can communicate with them in a natural manner, they can understand them, and they can make themselves and their personality and their needs known. The second type of goal is a literacy goal. This means that you want your children to read and write effectively in a language. Literacy goals are critical for languages that you want your children to be successful in through adulthood. Being able to read and write in a language means that children can access for themselves continued input in that language through text and through writing. And so if you want your children to maybe someday go to school in that language, or to be able to move back to that country and function, they need to be able to read and write effectively. So once you've considered your languages and considered your goals, you move forward to planning for your goals. Every global nomad family and every bilingual family outside their environment needs to have a family language plan. A family language plan does several things. First of all, it takes into account where you live and what languages you speak. It takes into account the goals you've set for your children in those languages, and it takes into account over a child's lifespan how to achieve those goals. Family language plans are generally divided into preschool years, early school years, secondary school, and university. Now, it may seem a lot to look at your 6-month-old child and plan for their university years, but realistically, you have to look ahead to what you think they might do and where you might be in order to make sure that that is a possibility for them. So, for example, if you're a French-speaking family living outside of France, but you think someday your child would like to go back to France to go to university, or you would like them to go back to France to go to university, you need to ensure that in the next 18 years they acquire French to a high enough level to be able to function in an academic environment. This will not happen by itself unless they go to a French school. If they don't go to a French school, this needs to be an element of your family language plan. So, as you look at each of the languages involved, you plan for where the input will come from in the early years, in the preschool years, where the input will come from in the school years, making sure to consider the non-school languages as priority over the school languages, and where the input is going to come from in the secondary school years, so that at the end of the journey, your children can meet the linguistic goals you've set for them. Now, for many families, one plan is enough. We call that Plan A. Plan A is if you are a bilingual family and you are living in a stable environment and nothing will change linguistically for your children over the course of their lives. If you are a mobile family, then you need often to have a Plan B and possibly a Plan C and possibly more plans according to where you think you might go. So how do you plan for uncertainty? What you plan for is for your language goals. So for example, if you live in the Netherlands now and you have Dutch as a language goal for your children, as a literacy goal, you want them to be able to read and write in Dutch fluently. but you think at some point you'll leave the Netherlands, then you plan accordingly to what resources you'll take with you, what people you'll bring on board, and how you will ensure that your child meets those Dutch goals, so that if they choose to come back to the Netherlands later, they have that as an option. The importance of family planning is not only the plan itself, but it's understanding the steps behind the plan, what you need to think about and what you need to consider to maximize input and output opportunities for your children and to plan for successful literacy. So once you've made one family plan, then you can easily make another because you understand the steps and the elements in the process. And these plans are then a part of your family and a part of your dynamic experience. The fourth step in the 6 steps for success is to talk to your children. Our children are not only a part of their own bilingual journey, but they are in many respects in charge of their own bilingual journey. Any parent who's tried to feed a child broccoli will know that you cannot force what goes into a child's mouth, but you also cannot force what goes out of a child's mouth. We may have the best intentions of our child speaking our language, but if the child is not on board, it's not going to happen. So from a very early age in bilingual families, we need to have an ongoing discussion about who speaks what languages and why. And when they're very little, you just say, for example, this is daddy's language and this is mummy's language, or this is mummy and daddy's language and this is the school's language. As they get older, you can increase the information that you're giving them so that they understand why you do what you do as well. So for example, if you speak French to your children and it's very important to you because it's the language you were raised in, you need to transmit to your children that even though they may speak to you in another language, it's very important to you to speak to them in French because it's how you feel comfortable talking to them. And so this brings us to the point of importance of language in everybody's life. We all have the right to choose our own important languages. We can encourage our children to make the choices we would like them to make, but we cannot force them to use a language. So what we need to do is, to the best of our ability, convince them of the usefulness of the languages we want them to use and to give them opportunities to use them. Because at the end of the day, we all get to make our own language choices. And many, many bilingual families find that there is one language that the children are reluctant to speak. There are lots of tips and tricks and methods that you can use to help your children want to use that language, but you cannot force them. Generally speaking, if you try to force your children, they will resist. And they will begin to see that language as something that's punitive and that they don't want to do. So if, while you're talking to your children, you find that they are not necessarily in agreement with your linguistic goals for them, think carefully about what methods you could use to entice their cooperation rather than try and force it. The fifth important point is to talk to other key people. A family's bilingual journey isn't something that they travel alone. They travel within their community and within their society, and everybody who comes into contact with your children also needs information about the choices you're making for your children. This starts with talking to your families, for example, about the choices you're making. So if you come from a monolingual environment and you're choosing for bilingualism for your children, you may have to talk to your family a lot about why you're making the choices you are and that you're comfortable and confident in them, and that they're not going to change their mind, and you're not going to change your mind. And so family is very important to have on board as a part of your bilingual journey, either just so they understand the choices you've made or because you need their help. If you have a family who speaks a minority language, it's very important to have their help with your children to increase the input your children get in that language and also to increase the status of that language within your family. So for example, if you have Greek as a third language in your family, you really want your children to master Greek, it's important that your Greek-speaking family use Greek to them and not any other language, and talk to them about the importance of Greek in their lives and how it's useful for them. And so family is the first support system around you for raising your bilingual children. The second part of your support system is your caregivers. When you are raising children with 2 or more languages, it's important to choose your caregivers carefully. So you cannot default to a caregiver who speaks whatever language they speak. You need to look at your family language situation, you need to look at your family language plan and decide which would be the best language for the caregivers to speak to your children in. This sometimes means having an au pair or a nanny rather than choosing for a daycare or a creche. It sometimes means having friends help you with your children. It sometimes means bringing in someone from your country, but if you are placing a priority on a language, you need to maximize input. So if both parents need to work and both parents speak Italian with the child, you would want, for example, to have somebody who speaks Italian with them during the day as well, because they are losing out on input time from the parents. So think about your caregivers, think about what language they're going to speak with your children, and think about how they are going to discuss issues of language with your children as well. It's also important to have the caregiver's cooperation with your plan, and that they understand why you're doing what you do. For example, when we first moved to the Netherlands, I chose a caregiver for my child who was Dutch, but who spoke English very well. I specifically asked her to please speak in Dutch to my child because I wanted her to learn Dutch. If not, she would have spoken in English because she worked for mostly English-speaking families. So a part of my language goal for my child was that she speak Dutch fluently, so I had to ensure that I found a caregiver who could do that and would do that. The last element of talking to other key people is to talk to your children's teachers. Once your children are in school, they will be immersed in the school language, which may not be your home language, and they'll also be immersed in the teacher's understandings of bilingualism or lack of understandings in bilingualism. And so if we go back to my very first point of learning the theory is critical for interacting with your children's teachers. Primary school teachers are generally not educated on child bilingualism in their initial teacher training, and will often have opinions of bilingualism that are based on what would be called common knowledge rather than research knowledge. And this includes, for example, saying things like, your child needs more Dutch, so please speak Dutch to them at home instead of English. Or, your child's Dutch isn't very good, so you should all make sure you speak Dutch all the time. This is a fallacy that if a child is learning a language at school, they also need it at home. In fact, the parent's job is to speak the mother tongue to the children. By the growth of the mother tongue, the second language will grow also. But if you were to, for example, survey primary school teachers, the majority of them would probably say that the children should be speaking the school language at home. It's a common misconception and myth about bilingualism, and it's very important that you as the parents be able to give the correct information to your children's teachers and be able to discuss with them all different elements of the bilingual journey that your children is on in terms of what is realistic for vocabulary acquisition, what is realistic for their syntax, how they are different from mother tongue speakers in the school, and many, many different elements of bilingualism in schools that are important for parents and teachers to be working together on. And the final of the 6 steps is to know when to get help. In most families' bilingual journeys, along the way, there'll be a road bump of some kind. Somebody may say to you, for example, your child doesn't speak very well. Are you sure that they don't have a problem? Or, your child isn't speaking very much. It must be because they have 2 languages. Again, if you know the theory, you may think that you understand that that's not true. But if you have any concerns with your bilingual children, it's very important to get help as soon as you can and not be afraid to access the resources that are there for you. One of the most common myths about bilingualism is that bilingual children speak later than monolingual children. This used to be a received notion in the bilingual world, but is no longer considered to be true. It is true that bilingual children often have a smaller vocabulary in each of their languages than monolingual children, which is perfectly normal. When you combine their vocabulary, it's usually larger. But if you feel that your child is considerably behind their peers and the other kids in their playgroup in terms of speech, it's important to get an evaluation by a speech therapist. And it's not only important to get an evaluation, but it's important to get the right evaluation. So when you are looking for a therapist to work with your child, whether it's a speech therapist or an educational specialist, it's important to find somebody who understands bilingualism and is empathetic to bilingualism and understands how bilingual children are different than monolingual children. Generally speaking, it's best to have them evaluated in their first language or their strongest language, but also to have them evaluated in their weaker languages to get a complete picture. If you are having problems with your child that are not necessarily related to language, but are related to their bilingual journey, you can bring on board bilingual information or bilingual specialists to help you look at your family language plan, to help you look at your family dynamic, to help you look at the input your children are getting, and to ensure that you have a plan in place that will get your children to where you want them to be at the end of the journey. But no matter which specialist you choose or how many specialists you choose, it's important to get help early so that you remain certain that what you're doing is right and that you remain certain that you're doing everything possible to help your child. If you have any other questions and concerns about your child bilingual journey, there are many books available to help you and websites. And if you take a quick look at the slide, you'll see what I consider to be the best resources available for parents of bilingual children.